where they strung up a man, whom they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Coffee is the best thing ever invented. The second best thing ever invented is the thermos, so it can keep your coffee hot for hours. Organic Man Coffee Trike has the best coffee around. Stop by 4501 McPherson. Hand over a few measly dollars, and they will hand you heaven in a cup. If it's too far to drive, you can always visit organicmancoffeetrike.shop. The Cold War broke out right after the Hot War, which was World War II. Why cold? Well, there were no armies charging across each other's borders, invading each other. There were no bombers raining down terror from above. The folks in power told us just about every day, those commies are going to try to sneak in and to blow us up, so you have to be on the alert each and every day. We had those duck and cover drills every week. I think it was a Tuesday around 10 o'clock in the morning. They had a huge air raid siren on top of the roof of the school, and they would blow that sucker, and that meant it was time to get down on the floor and hide under our desks. Like that was going to do anything. They would show videos of the destruction at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had built these fake cities out in the desert, and they would set off a nuclear bomb, and then they would show the destruction as the shock wave wiped out everything. There wasn't much left once the shock wave went by. I saw these shows over and over, and I got to wondering, if a well-built house miles from the blast could be wiped from the face of the earth, what safety could there be under a desk on the second floor of an old brick building that was mostly windows? It made no sense. Also, there was an air base about 3 miles from our school. It became quite apparent that hiding under my desk was not going to save my life. I got to wondering, why didn't they take us down to the bottom floor where all the civil defense supplies were stored? Under every stairwell, at the end of every hallway, and in a few no longer used classrooms, there were piles of boxes and canisters with the circle with a triangle in it, with the large C and D representing civil defense. This was the food to be used once the city was nothing but ashes, and one or two people were lucky enough to still have a pulse. Looking at the bottom of my desk at all that gum stuck under there, I was really wondering, why are we doing this? I discovered a little something called radiation. Once the bombs had fallen, the area around the blast site would be veritably glowing at night. Thus the term, nuke 'em till they glowed. Anyone unlucky enough to still be alive was destined for a long, painful death. Now I was wondering, why hide under our desks? We should all run to the windows and die on our feet. Hollywood began pumping out movies about what radiation might do to the local wildlife. Movies like Them, giant ants that were mutated after atomic bombs were tested in the desert. Godzilla, which I managed to see without having Raymond Burr cluttering up the scenery. The best end of the world movie was by far Dr. Strangelove. I've seen it a few times. It was what you would call a dark comedy. Slim Pickens riding the bomb down towards that Soviet ICBM site. That was the best scene ever. The future was looking grim. I began to wonder, why bother studying things like economics and social studies or math? What I wanted to learn was how to survive the aftermath of the coming nuclear war that was coming no matter what anybody said or did. I was 4 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't remember any of that. I do remember hearing about folks building fallout shelters in their backyards, or sometimes under their houses. I asked our dad why we didn't have one. He was of the opinion the world was going to end soon anyway, and there was nothing we could do about it, except maybe have another drink. Yes, he consumed a bit of the grape all the time. Growing up, waiting for a huge explosion tends to slant your thought process. I slowly began to realize all that duck and cover wasn't to save our lives. It was to make people think we could survive a nuclear war. Yeah, right. Only if we were among the elites who had built enormous shelters using taxpayer dollars to save their worthless lives after they started an unwinnable war. The folks in Washington and Moscow made sure they had a place to run so they could rattle their sabers and act tough. The rest of us were cannon fodder. I slept well at night knowing the folks in Washington would be safe and sound under the Greenbrier Hotel while I slowly died from radiation poisoning. Nothing I learned in school seemed to have any bearing on the future. As Arthur Dent would say, this is it. We're all going to die. I learned a whole lot more once I was no longer being trained by the public school system. Things like just how real was the Cold War? Once Germany surrendered, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union got together in Yalta, Crimea to decide the fate of Germany, as well as most of Europe. Most countries had been bombed into rubble or ransacked by the Nazis. The rich folks were just as poor as the poor folks. Most of the gold stolen from the surrounding countries had been spirited away to South America. There wasn't much to build on, let alone with. Russia wanted to expand their socialist agenda. They wanted as much of Europe as they could get. The trouble with socialism is you run out of other people's money. So you have to keep finding new other countries that you could steal money from them to support your ideas. Instead of administering and policing Germany side by side as the Allies did in post war Austria, the decision was made to divide Germany into four distinct occupation zones, one for each Allied nation, which included France, even though they hadn't been at that conference. The British were assigned the northwest quadrant, the French the southwest. The Americans got the southeast. Since the Soviet Army already occupied much of eastern Germany, the Soviet Union was put in charge of the northeast quadrant, which included the capital, Berlin. Berlin itself was also subdivided into four quadrants: the British, French, and Soviets, and the Americans, each policing a different zone of the capital, which was fully surrounded by the Soviet occupation territory. The Soviet army and the Russian civilians had suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis during the war. What is surprising, as German army rolled into Russia on June 22nd, 1941, They were greeted as a liberating army. The common folks had suffered badly under Stalin, and they saw the Germans as their saviors. Had the Nazis behaved themselves, the whole situation on the Eastern Front would have been quite different. The Nazis began rounding up people they didn't like and killing them. Soon the Russians began to realize that their saviors were just as bad, if not worse, than their original oppressors. When it came to carrying out the joint directive of denazification, the Soviets not only arrested Nazi officials, they considered all major German landowners to be Nazis. They confiscated their land because there was nobody there to stop them. The Big Three had decided Germany would be allowed to vote on who would run things just as soon as they got going again. The Soviets acted as if Germany would be able to run themselves and allowed the formation of independent political parties in their zone of command, but soon everybody was being forced to merge into the Communist Party, which was controlled by Moscow. This move was heavily criticized by the Western Allies. The main reason the German economy collapsed after World War I was they had to pay billions of dollars in reparations demanded at the Treaty of Versailles. The British, French, and Americans wanted to avoid that same mistake, but the Soviet Union, whose own economy was heavily damaged by the Germans during the war, wanted Germany to pay up and pay up big. Instead of making Germany pay money for the damages from the war, a deal was struck where the Soviets would allow food to be grown and hard goods manufactured in their occupation zone. This would then be sold to the West for cash. It didn't take long for the exports to be halted. The folks back in Moscow wanted the cash and the food and the manufactured goods shipped back home for their use. Once no food was being shipped west, the US, France, and Britain all stopped sending money into East Germany. The Soviets complained because nobody was paying for the damages after all that fighting. During 1946, tensions escalated further as Soviet military forces helped to establish communist regimes in Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Albania. 1947, Great Britain and the United States decided to merge their two occupation zones in order to foster more economic cooperation between the regions. The large new territory was called Bizonia, or referring to the two zones that made up its borders. The Western Allies took things a step further by stepping up economic aid to Bizonia, along with the French occupied territory, with cash from the Marshall Plan. They replaced Germany's badly inflated currency, the Reichsmark, with a new and more stable Deutschmark. All of these actions were taken without Soviet approval. When the Western Allies tried to circulate the new Deutschmarks in Berlin, the Soviets boycotted the Allied Control Council. And when the West didn't bow to their demands, Stalin ordered a total blockade of Berlin, which was 100 miles inside Soviet occupied territory. All roads, train rails, and rivers were cut off. The three Western control zones in Berlin found themselves cut off from all outside aid. The citizens were being used as pawns in a deadly game of chess. The Western forces didn't bow to Stalin. Instead, they devised airdrops. Food, fuel, medicine, and clothing was placed aboard cargo planes and parachuted out over West Berlin. The effort was so successful, the people in Western zones were far better off than the ones stuck in the Soviet zone. The Soviets were eventually forced to open up access to Berlin once more. Later that same year, France officially merged its occupied territory into Bazonia, creating the Federal Republic of Germany, or what became known as West Germany. In October of 49, the Soviet Union responded with the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, the communist state known as East Germany. Some say the Cold War got kicked off when, in June 1950, Soviet backed North Korean People's Army invaded its pro Western neighbors to the south. Anytime you hear the People's anything, just insert communists, which means the few at the top have all the power and all the wealth. The Korean War was run by a committee in the United Nations, which is probably the worst way to do anything. Just to show how dumb things were, Russia was a part of the UN and on the Korean Defense Committee. They sat in on any big decisions made involving the troops. Anytime Douglas MacArthur came up with a plan, the Soviets were right there listening in. China wasn't a part of the UN, but they were receiving daily updates from their semi allies, the Russians. March 31st, first, I'm making up words again. March 31st, the UN forces had again reached the 38th parallel, the line between North and South Korea. MacArthur now publicly advocated an extension of the war into China because the Chinese were the ones that started the whole thing. One of his big ideas was to use nuclear bombs inside China. I believe he wanted like 32 weapons to be dropped on China. He was quite vocal about not just stopping the communists, but he wanted to bomb them into the Stone Ages. April 11th, 1951, U.S. President Harry Truman relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, that's a 5-star general, of his command. That's when MacArthur made that famous speech about old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And then he died a little while later. As the Soviets kept increasing their totalitarian control of the Germans, many decided they would simply leave, move to the West. 1952, East Germany began policing its western border to stop the flight of engineers, scientists, and doctors to West Germany. The military set up checkpoints along all roads leading out of Germany, and yet Berlin was still relatively open. People were fleeing by the bus loads. Well, actually, it was the subway load. They would board the underground in East Berlin, ride to a station in West Berlin, and get out. There were also some people traveling to the east. Spies were freely walking into the East Berlin to have a look-see at what the Soviets were up to. They would also encourage scientists, doctors, educated people, or anybody that wanted to flee to the West to go ahead. The only people remaining in East Germany were the people who accepted what they had, or they were just too scared to try to get away. 1953, Joe the Georgian died. If you didn't know, Joseph Stalin was from Georgia, the country by the Black Sea, not the state. That would have been weird if he'd been from Georgia, the state. He was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. This allowed the East and the West to kind of turn down the rhetoric a bit. Just maybe the Cold War could be turned off completely. Eisenhower became president of the U.S., and maybe it was time for a new world view. Y'all stay on your side of the planet, we'll stay on our side of the planet, and no more trying to kill each other. 1955, the United States and other members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known better as NATO, made West Germany a member of their team, and then they permitted them to remilitarize. Up until then, Germany wasn't allowed to have any real military, kind of like after World War I. The Soviets responded with the Warsaw Pact, a mutual defense organization between the Soviet Union, Albania, Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. This set up a unified military command under Marshal Ivan Eskhonov of the Soviet Union. Both sides of the Cold War were maneuvering their forces to be in the best possible position to pounce on the other side. All it would take was the wrong button being pushed or somebody misunderstanding a radar blip. UFOs have been with us for as far back as recorded time. In the late 40s, a sudden surge of reports began to come in. At first, the military took these sightings seriously. They actually looked into any UFO reports as being a real possible flying craft. The folks seeing flying discs would call the local air base and tell them what they had seen. On some nights, the switchboards would be overrun by calls coming in. Someone got worried. What if? What if those Soviets pulled a sneak attack right in the middle of a UFO flap? How would the folks in Washington manage to tell any of the air bases it was time to launch a counterstrike? The same phone lines were used by anyone trying to contact the bases. This led to the CIA initiating several committees to look into UFO reports and make them go away. Make folks believe that only crazy people saw UFOs. Or, more to the point, only crazy people talked about what they'd seen. Let's just ignore the possible invasion from outer space while we're focusing on the possible invasion from the Soviets. UFOs were very much a part of the Cold War. The CIA used it as a cover for some of their clandestine operations. No, you didn't see a top secret spy plane. You must have seen a UFO. Only crazy people see UFOs. Are you crazy? This is the whole thing behind a catch-22. Joseph Heller came up with the term in his book by the same name. A catch-22 results from rules, regulations, or procedures that an individual is subject to but has no control over, because to fight the rules is to accept them. Another example is a situation in which someone is in need of something that can only be had by not being in need of it. You can only get a loan at the bank if you have money. One implication of the term is that the creators of the catch-22 situation have created arbitrary rules in order to justify and conceal their own abuse of power. Only crazy people see UFOs. I'm still hearing that today. The CIA was telling the president the Soviets were building up massive numbers of bombers in order to attack the West. This was their job: gather intel and pass it on to the president. Intel, not supposition. 1958, President Eisenhower did not want American pilots flying the U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union. He was concerned that if one of the planes were to crash, that the pilot would, hey, it's an American Air Force pilot shot down over Russia. That would look very bad. This would be considered an act of aggression which could spark further conflicts between the two countries. In order to ease the burden of flying Americans into Soviet airspace, The idea came up to have British pilots from the Royal Air Force fly these missions in place of American pilots who were working for the CIA. The spy planes didn't find any masses of intercontinental bombers as they thought. Instead, they found the exact opposite. The Soviets were far behind what the experts had all said they would be. Khrushchev arrived in the United States September 15th, 1959. He was here for an extended visit and a meeting with Eisenhower. The first days of the Russia's visits were more of a photo op than any kind of an actual mission. While visiting Los Angeles, Khrushchev became infuriated by comments that were being made by the 20th Century Fox News department. He also threw a tantrum when he was barred from visiting Disneyland. I would love to have seen Khrushchev running around wearing a set of Mickey Mouse ears, or maybe a picture of him and Minnie Mouse together, smiling at the camera. Whoever decided that they weren't going to let Khrushchev into Disneyland is an unpatriotic commie pinko. Now, I don't know what to call him, but that was what an opportunity they missed. Here's Khrushchev riding the roller coaster. You know, here's Khrushchev with Donald Duck. They kind of look alike. Did I say that out loud? After 2 days of meetings, Eisenhower and Khrushchev issued a joint communique. They both said they agreed these discussions have been useful in clarifying each other's position in a number of subjects. They hoped their exchanges of views will contribute to a better understanding of the motives and positions of each, and thus to achieve a just and lasting peace. In particular, they believed that the question of general disarmament is the most important one facing the world today. This was back in what, 1957? Before I was even born? 59, right after I was born. The U-2 spy plane had successfully flown over the Soviet Union twice, piloted by British pilots. The CIA decided it was far better to have U.S. pilots at the controls. I wonder why. In April 1960, a U-2 was sent out over the Soviets and managed to get itself shot down. The U-2 was shot down near Kosolino in the Ural region, and it was hit by an S-75 surface-to-air missile fired by a battery that was stationed there. The SA-75 site had been identified previously by the CIA using photos taken during Vice President Nixon's visit to Sverdlovsk the previous summer. It looked like the CIA knew that this was a dangerous location. They already knew what was there, and yet they decided to target it for photographs anyway. The pilot next didn't use his suicide pill, and he wound up in the hands of the KGB. Khrushchev knew the plane was CIA, and he had the pilot in custody. He kept it quiet, waiting for the U.S. to try to cover up the incident. When the U.S. military came out and said the U-2 was a NASA weathercraft, the Soviets pulled the pilot on trial and said, "Look, the United States is trying to invade us." Eisenhower had been scheduled to meet with Khrushchev that same year, but all future peace talks were canceled. The Soviets began to escalate buildup of the bombers. That was what the CIA had originally been trying to prove. This is just speculation on my part. Could there have been some kind of a behind the scenes plan to derail the talks between the US and the Soviets? If the Soviets were not much of a threat, did the US need a massive intelligence network? All those companies making millions of dollars building bombers and spy planes and other weapons of mass destruction wouldn't have any customers. All those tax dollars would have gone to other things like fixing up our country, feeding folks. President Eisenhower warned the American public to beware of the military industrial complex in his farewell address to the nation in 1961. He cautioned against the undue influence of the arms industry on government policy and spending. He was also going to warn us about the press being in on it, but his advisors told him not to. Don't talk bad about the folks that are telling others what you said. If you upset the press, they'll just lie about what you're saying. Even back then. February 15th of June 1961, first secretary of the Socialist Union Party and GDR State Council Chairman Walter Ulbricht stated in an international press conference, "No one is planning on building a wall between the East and the West." The folks in Moscow thought all those folks that were leaving the workers' paradise must be confused. They just need to be enlightened. August 12th and 13th, 1961, East German soldiers in Berlin laid out miles of barbed wire that would become known as the Berlin Wall, sealing the border with West Germany. The subway lines that crossed from east to west were shut down and the tunnels were blockaded. Winston Churchill described the threat of the Soviet communism as an iron curtain descending across the European continent. This was considered to be the real kickoff of the Cold War. Both sides began stockpiling massive nuclear weapons. They did testing in the air and underground. They blew up things like there really was no tomorrow. The power of each new generation of weapons made the old ones look weak. Soon entire cities would be wiped out from the face of the earth by just one bomb. Instead of flying the bombs to each other's cities, they discovered that they could launch them at each other using intercontinental missiles. These missiles would be dropping from the sky with little or no warning. From launch to impact was about 30 minutes. You could maybe say a few prayers, say goodbye to anybody that was standing around nearby. There wasn't even enough time to run for the hills. By the time you got in your car and got to the edge of town, well, there would be no more town. Each and every time the world powers seemed on the brink of coming to an agreement, something major popped up, causing one side or the other to withdraw from any treaties. Now, don't get me wrong, a treaty is just a piece of paper with a few signatures on it that has all the power and control of a comic book. How many times have treaties been broken? Don't have enough time in a week to go over them. You can just say that a treaty is not worth the paper they're written on. Spies were being sent out by both sides to find out what new and wonderful weapons of mass destruction the other side had invented. Too many people will think spy and they imagine 007, tuxedos and casinos. Not even close. Most spies are not just ordinary looking, they're forgettable. That's what they strive for. They sneak into a country under some pretense, usually as a worker at an embassy or a consulate. They go fishing, looking for disgruntled citizens or folks who think they know what's best for everyone else. One bizarre justification I hear a lot is, why should the U.S. have some special weapon and not the other guys? It's not right. This drives me nuts. It's kind of like saying that every crazy person walking the streets talking to themselves should be given a machete to help them deal with their inner demons. We need to arm these crazy people. People living in the US began thinking the Soviet Union was the workers' paradise because that's what they were telling us. They actually thought the Soviets were far superior to the US because they were socialists. Everyone owns everything and they're all happy and well fed. I can understand unambitious workers thinking this way. Why should the owner of the business who pays rent and taxes and the light bill and the cost of everything going on in the business get more money than the poor person standing at the counter bagging produce? What blows my mind is many of the highly educated people are thinking the same things. Julius Rosenberg was an enthusiastic communist. He worked at the Army Signal Corps engineering laboratories. How he got his security clearance is a wonder. A Soviet spy paid him a visit on Labor Day in 1942. The place he worked was responsible for things like radar and radio communications, codes, and encryptions. 1944, Julius became a recruiter for the Russians, actively looking for anyone who just might be willing to share U.S. secrets with the Soviets. He even recruited his brother in law, David Greenglass. Greenglass worked at the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Well, the authorities eventually uncovered a spy ring in New Mexico, which then led back to Julius and his wife. The FBI raided the Rosenbergs' home and they arrested Julius. Ethel was later arrested while leaving a federal courthouse in New York City after testifying that she had no knowledge of espionage efforts. The FBI hoped that her arrest would force Julius to name names of other communist sympathizers. The Rosenbergs and Greenglass were found guilty of espionage. Sentencing guidelines gave the judge two choices for the three: 30 years imprisonment or death. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover suggested a 30-year term for Ethel, hoping that she would name names while sitting in prison. Judge Irving Kaufman chose death for both of the Rosenbergs. David Greenglass got a 15-year sentence, which he served 9 years of. The Rosenbergs were executed by electrocution June 19, 1953, at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. They were the only spies executed in the U.S. I always get a kick out of the name Sing Sing. It was used in a lot of comedies and cartoons. The name Sing Sing was derived from the Sint Sing Indian tribe from whom the land was purchased in 1685. Originally, the building was named the Mount Pleasant Prison. Talk about a misnomer. Because most of the early convicted criminals traveled by boat to Sing Sing, the phrase up the river came to mean going to prison. Anytime a spy was arrested, the folks in charge would try to turn them, make them into double agents. The trouble with double agents was they could just as easily turn again once back home. Any intel they sent to their handlers was suspect until confirmed by a second or third source. Even when a second spy was telling the same story, there was always a possibility that this second person was also a double agent. Another problem is the folks collecting intel sometimes ignored good information and passed on bogus stuff. The sorting of tons of documents and audio recordings can be overwhelming. This looks good and that sounds crazy. There's also the problem if the folks in Langley decide they don't like the President of the United States, their boss, they just might withhold something that would lead to an embarrassing situation for the man in the White House, even when this malfeasance might involve the deaths of many citizens. Now, this might sound a bit bizarre, but it happens. Those people believe that the end justifies the means, no matter how nasty the means might be. The Dulles brothers come to mind. President Eisenhower appointed John Dulles Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles was the director of the CIA. As far as they were both concerned, the world economy, the security and happiness of the world's people depended on the ability of giant American corporations being able to function freely in the world. Those commies were a threat to world peace. The Dulles brothers saw danger coming from the Soviet Union once they had nuclear weapons. They also saw an equal danger coming from countries all over the world that were embracing what we now know as nationalism. Any country that was more concerned with taking care of their own people were not looking out for the best interests of global corporations. Countries that decided they didn't want to be involved in the Cold War looked as if they were siding with the Pinkos. The Dulles brothers decided it was their place in the world to decide what was right for everyone. Allen Dulles would pass on false intel saying that some country was on the verge of going communist unless steps were taken to stop them. John Dulles would use his position to withhold aid to any countries that didn't want to play ball with the CIA or the State Department. They both lied to the president as well as the people of the United States. Their actions led to thousands of deaths all over the world. That whole butterfly effect, only in a large way. After Allen Dulles had lied to President Kennedy about the situation in Cuba, he got fired. After Kennedy was murdered, who gets put in charge of the committee looking into the death of the president? None other than Allen Dulles. Nothing to see here. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Some people who get involved in the intelligence community tend to fall into the thought process they know more about what's good for the country. They have all the intel. They know more about how the world works than any elected politician. The person in the White House might be there for 4, maybe 8 years. The political parties with the most votes might not be on the same wavelength as the people with all the spies. Sometimes the intelligence agencies turn on their bosses. Spies sometimes got caught and they would wind up in prison. They would sit in a cell waiting for one of two things to happen. They might get kicked out of the country that they were spying on, or they might be traded for other spies being held by the other folks. Operation Mockingbird is supposed to have been a large scale CIA operation. It began in the early years of the Cold War and was a plan to manipulate domestic American news media organizations for propaganda purposes. They recruited leading American journalists into their propaganda network and influenced the operations of front groups. The National Student Association was receiving funding from the CIA. In 1975, the Church Committee Congressional Investigations revealed agency connections with journalists and civic groups. The Church Committee was also known as the United States Senate Select Committee to study government operations with respect to intelligence activities. Why such a long name? They should have just called it the Spy Hunt or the Spy Watch, something like that. It was a Senate Select Committee in 1975 that investigated abuses by the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and the IRS. Does any of this sound familiar? Chaired by Idaho Senator Frank Church, the committee was part of a series of investigations into intelligence abuse. 1977, the reporter Carl Bernstein, you might recognize that name if you're a bit older, wrote the relationship between the CIA and the media was far more extensive than what the Church Committee had revealed. During the early decades of the Cold War, some journalists even became outright CIA assets. Most mainstream media outlets advanced the agenda of the narrative put forth by the CIA and other members of the national security state. I knew a guy in the Army intelligence way back when, and yes, I know the jokes about Army intelligence. Hmm. His job was to watch for anybody slipping over the Berlin Wall so he could interview them to find out any little pieces of information that might eventually turn into a big pile of intel. One day he received word there was a guy in a Russian army coat drinking in a bar near the border. Sorry about that. I'm not quite over that cold I had last week. My friend rushed over to see what was going on. Sure enough, there was a guy dressed in a Soviet style coat. When asked, it turned out that he was not in the military, he was a baker. This guy's job was to deliver baked goods to the soldiers along the border. It was cold, and so he had traded some fresh bread for the coat. During his many trips along the border, the baker noticed there was a stretch of barbed wire fence none of the guard towers could see. It was in a kind of a low spot. Looking at the fence and thinking it would be nice to be on the other side, one day he stopped his truck and just walked over to the fence, crawled under it. Now he was in West Germany. He did what he thought was best. He went to get drunk. My friend asked him how he'd managed to get through the minefield. The baker looked at him and said, "What minefield?" He had somehow walked through a minefield without knowing that they were there, and somehow he managed to not trip one. Talk about getting lucky. That guy must have had like 4 or 5 guardian angels, and I'll bet every one of them had to retire shortly thereafter. Billions of dollars went into building bigger and better bombs. Millions more went into telling us, the world, about the end that was going to come soon, unless we allowed the folks in Washington to do things that we did not approve of. Things like invading other countries or killing people that we didn't have a problem with, but we were told it was for the good of the country. As all that money was being spent to protect us, millions more, like billions, wound up in people's pockets. Folks became very rich in the name of world peace through massive armament. The military industrial complex Eisenhower had warned us about. Who needs tanks and jets and bombers if there's nobody to use them on? You have to manufacture an enemy to justify your production, I guess. The Romans said, "Si vis pacem, para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war. How much preparation do you need? Do you need to be able to wipe out the entire planet 18 times? The U.S. spent about $8 trillion on military toys during the Cold War. This was the cost from the early 50s right up until the Iron Curtain came down. There's no account of how many people died from direct or indirect actions from both sides of the Cold War. How much money went into protecting us from those murderous Soviets who turned out to be nothing like what we were being told? As I was growing up, I heard those nasty people in Russia wanted to kill us because we were not like them. They were all crazy, knowing that we were better than them. Oh, that's what I was told. Heard it on the news over and over. In the army, I was told that the Soviets were bloodthirsty, but we had better weapons than them, and God was on our side. The only good commie was a dead commie. Once the wall fell down and the people over there were able to tell us about their lives, it turned out that they were told about the same thing, with the exception of the God part. They didn't want to kill us. Most of them just wanted to live their lives and have a good time. Many of them wanted to be us. All the money that could have been used to fix up the country was being poured into building weapons. Some weapons production was not that well done, and people got sick and died from exposure to chemicals and radioactivity, all in the name of trying to kill the enemy. If the commies weren't the bloodthirsty savages the folks in intel community kept telling us they were, who was lying to who? Was there any real need for thousands of bombs that could blow up our planet several times over? Did our intelligence agencies pass on lies and half truths to justify their own existence? To add to the whole mess, we now have thousands of nuclear weapons sitting around slowly rusting and no place to store them. Is it really a good idea to pile all those things together, hoping that one of them won't accidentally set off a chain reaction? I understand there's a lot of them here in Texas and out in New Mexico. As the Iron Curtain was coming down, a few thousand Soviet troops found themselves in foreign countries with no way to get home. Some had to abandon their equipment in hopes of walking or getting a lift back to the Russia. There were weapons left in secret places, simply abandoned because it was too costly and too difficult to get them back to their country. The Soviet Union denied stockpiling nuclear missiles in Poland. Archaeologists and researchers have uncovered massive underground silos used for nuclear weapons. The weapons are supposed to be all gone, but have they found all of these silos yet? Those who researched the place by delving into archives and declassified satellite images and analyzing building scans are convinced otherwise. Some of the silos for those warheads are found near Born Sulinawa in the village of Beznica Kolonia. I think that's how it's pronounced. It's Polish. During the Cold War, the zone was one of the best kept secrets in Europe. 1984. I was sitting in the office at the fire station one day. The TV was on in the next room and it was showing the news. I don't remember what we were talking about, but in the quiet moment, we all heard President Reagan say, "My fellow Americans, I am pleased to tell you today that I have signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." I sprayed coffee out of my nose. Holy cow, we were about to go toe to toe with the Ruskies. Yes, that's slim pickings as Major Kong. Later, I found out that President Reagan was only kidding in his bizarre way. Mutual assured destruction, also known as MAD, is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy which theorizes a launch of nuclear weapons by an attacker on a nuclear armed defender with second strike capabilities would cause the complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. It was described as two men sitting across from each other at a card table, each holding a shotgun aimed at the other. Not really. A better description was two men, both holding dead man switches that were attached to nuclear weapons that were now activated. As a parade of fools marched around them, yelling and screaming and waving their hands in the air. Somebody just might twitch at the wrong moment. I really thought the conflict between NATO and the Soviet Union would go on forever. I was going to grow old and watch as more and more money was spent on killing every last one of us. February 1989, the Hungarian Politburo recommended the government dismantle the Iron Curtain. The opening of the border gate between Austria and Hungary at the Pan American Picnic, August 1989, set in motion a chain reaction at the end of which there was no longer an East and West Germany, and the Eastern Bloc disintegrated. Austrian Chancellor Franz Vronsky received clearance from Gorbachev May 3rd, 1989, and in May, the destruction of the Iron Curtain took place. As the Iron Curtain began to come down, news spread, causing more and more countries to call for the destruction of the Iron Curtain in their area. I was amazed watching as the wall was hammered and pounded until the two Germanys became one. Gorbachev resigned in December 1991, and what was left of the Soviet parliament voted themselves out of office. You know, a lot of the money to be used to build the Iron Curtain wound up in few people's secret bank accounts. Money intended to supply military equipment also got misplaced. How many trillion dollars did the Pentagon misplace in September 2001, just before the big event? Yikes. All the black budget money here in the US, billions, was used to pay people's retirement funds. All those nuclear weapons built by NATO and the Soviets, those things were real. The hostilities between the two sides was mostly malfunction, manufactured by the folks like the military industrial complex so they could make billions while the rest of us went without and lived in fear. As people on both sides of the war nervously watched the skies for incoming missiles, the elites piled up tons of cash brought in by way of tax dollars and lived like kings. As kids grew up worried that their future was going to look like a scene out of the Road Warrior, their kids grew up thinking that someday the entire world was going to be theirs. 1963, when President Kennedy was pushing for a joint US Soviet moon mission, he wound up catching a few bullets in Dallas. Could it be the folks in charge didn't have the new best enemy lined up yet to take on the guise of a global threat? Apollo Soyuz was the first crewed international space mission carried out jointly by the United States and the Soviet Union in July 1975, 14 years before the Iron Curtain came down. It would appear the Soviets didn't really want to kill us, not when we were able to have joint missions in outer space. Why didn't the crew of the Apollo uh, uh, spacecraft and the Soyuz spacecraft attack each other like what was supposed to be happening here on the planet? If you watch the news, the folks who are our newest best friends will probably soon become our archenemies. The people we are accused of nasty, horrible things will suddenly become our allies because there's somebody else to take their place. How many of our horrible adversaries out there at one time were being financed by U.S. tax dollars. History isn't written by the victors. It's written by the folks with the most money. We may never know all the lies and deceits passed on to us in the name of national security. How many lives were wasted to keep those people from moving over to here? Each passing day, I believe less and less of what the news agencies tell me. It's gotten to a point where when a politician starts to speak, I just immediately assume he's lying. Anytime a doctor says anything on the news, I'm like, yeah, right, I don't think so. Drug companies, don't want to hear from them. If they say that this pill will cure a headache, it probably won't. But that's the world that they've created for us. If you enjoyed tonight's show, hope I didn't worry you too much about life, the universe, and, well, if you enjoyed the show, tell your neighbors, tell your friends. If your partner at work gets up and walks away and leaves his computer open, punch up Strange Things with Chris James on his computer and hit play. See what happens when he gets back. And if you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to go to Amazon.com and buy one of my books. The Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh, and the Paranormal Laredo, and Paranormal Stories. And if you've got a story that you'd like to share, you can contact me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.